From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Last month, in Paris's 8th arrondissement, President Trump's negotiating team arrived at the 300-year-old presidential palace for talks with the French government on how to end the war in Ukraine.
So we appreciate you could make it, Steve. Thank you very much.
I wouldn't miss it. This is too important.
The Americans certainly ruffled a few feathers. Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's special envoy, began by comparing France's Élysée Palace, which is older than the United States of America, to Trump's glitzy Florida resort.
You know what this looks like? This actually looks like President Trump's club in Mar-a-Lago.
Really?
What you have, this gold. Yeah, no, the gold. Jonathan,
But worse was to come as they unveiled their catastrophic plan for the war in Ukraine, which would only benefit the Russians.
Ukraine's president is blasting the U.S. Special Envoy for siding with Russia.
Donald Trump ordered the Treasury and State Department to look into lifting economic sanctions against Russia.
He said that Ukraine could forget about NATO membership, arguably the biggest thing that Vladimir Putin wants.
But what a difference a month makes. Since then, there's been a complete reversal in the rhetoric coming out of the Oval Office.
U.S. President Trump appears to be softening his tone on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky.
Just hours ago, President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, pissed off with Russia's President Putin.
What is your level of frustration with President Putin?
I didn't like last night. We're in the midst of talking peace and missiles were fired, and I was not happy with it.
So what's going on behind the scenes? Is Trump's bromance with Putin really over? And with the prospect of a new round of peace talks potentially starting tomorrow, are Putin and Zelensky both just putting on a show for Donald Trump, or is this a genuine step forward? The Story today: why Trump is pissed off with Putin. Well, would you mind just starting by reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
I'm Mark Galeotti. I'm the director of the consultancy Mayak Intelligence and the author of, most recently, Forged in War, A Military History of Russia.
Mark, we've spoken to you on the podcast throughout this war. We were told by Donald Trump during the campaigning phase that if he came to power, the war would be over within 24 hours.
I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order, and it will take me no longer than one day. I know exactly what to say to each of them. I got along very well with them.
Of course, that didn't happen, but now, more than 100 days into the Trump presidency, and after months of failed negotiations and false starts in this peace process, there is a lot of excitement about the prospect of direct talks between Zelensky and Putin that might happen tomorrow in Istanbul. We're told Donald Trump might even attend. What do you make of that?
As of recording, we haven't had the Russians saying that Putin's going to be going. And to be honest, I would be really surprised if he was. First of all, it generally takes weeks for all the protocol and security details for a Putin visit to be arranged. Secondly, Putin didn't actually offer to go himself. He wasn't even necessarily saying that Zelensky should go. I mean, all he was saying was actually that Russian and Ukrainian delegations should be meeting to talk. Zelensky, wanting to sort of up the ante, said, "Oh, I'll be there, will you?" But this wasn't the original intent. And however sort of cinematic it may be, the fact of the matter is that peace deals are not arranged between the principals usually. They get together for the final event and the signing of the document, but actual real negotiations are a careful, complex, incredibly detailed activity, which is usually done precisely by expert delegations operating out of sight of the world's media. So this, frankly, to me, seems much more theatrical than anything else.
Well, Mark, it does feel like a lot of the theatre around this potential event, if it happens, does come down to both Zelensky and even Putin, to an extent, suddenly feeling like they have to play up to what Donald Trump wants. And I suppose that's partly because he does seem to change his mind an awful lot in this conflict. He started off seeming very much on the side of Vladimir Putin, parroting Russian narratives.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. And Zelensky probably maybe he wants to keep the gravy train going. President Zelensky talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that basically couldn't be won.
And then he seems to have changed his mind several times to try and understand what's been happening behind the scenes and how we've got here. Take us back to a particular moment in March and a game of golf in Florida.
Yes, I think, look, everyone is learning the art of diplomacy in the era of Donald Trump, and the fact that it involves rather different approaches. In this case, we had the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, who is much like Donald Trump himself, keen golfer.
My dad had told me that, whatever happens with your golf, remember, it'll be useful in life at some stage. I was going, come on, Dad. So, here I am. I was, well, hey.
They went and played a game of golf at one of Trump's resorts in Florida. This was actually playing a diplomatic blinder, it had to be said, because it means that not only is it a much more informal setting, away from cameras, it's an extended period of time in which, although he's quite coy about exactly what was said.
Yeah, I guess the starting point is to say what happens on a golf course stays on a golf course.
No.
But it does give you context.
Worldwide.
I mean...
Stubb was precisely able to bend the Donald's ear.
It did give us an opportunity to discuss a few issues. Of course, we talked about bilateral things, so Finland and the US. We talked about NATO, and at the time we also talked about Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine.
One of the ways that people do have a tendency to deal with Trump is precisely to praise him in ways that they hope will nudge him in that particular direction. So Stubb was also very keen to say, first of all, there was nothing that Trump had said that makes him fear for NATO's future.
The Americans are pushing the Europeans and the other allies to take more responsibility, and I think the Americans are right for doing it.
But also made the point that whereas at first the Americans seemed to be quite keen to bring the Russians to the negotiating table, increasingly they have begun to realize that in fact the Russians are not that keen on an early peace process, really speaking to Trump's own concern that maybe Putin was actually just simply stringing him along.
Now, I think the response that we're seeing from Russia is haphazard or actually negative. And now a lot of the American administration is rightly saying that time is running out.
So, from what Stubb was saying, Trump was very kind of receptive to the sort of line that, frankly, most European countries have been trying to impress on the American president.
And Mark, almost immediately after that game of golf, it seemed to have a real impact because Donald Trump very publicly changed his opinion.
Yes, I mean, ironically enough, Putin came out saying essentially that Zelensky was not a legitimate president because elections had been suspended, which, let's be clear, is actually required by the Ukrainian constitution in a time of war and martial law. This is something that Trump himself had been saying beforehand. But suddenly we have Trump coming out and talking to NBC, actually ringing up NBC, to say that he's pissed off with Putin and that Putin questioned Zelensky's legitimacy and he really ought not to have done that. Now, the point is not to get bogged down in the detail, because precisely with Trump, the details don't matter. It's the fact that all of a sudden, Putin is doing something that Trump had been doing, and now Trump is calling him out for it.
It did seem like a remarkable about-turn, and yet, almost inevitably, it didn't last. Tell us about the next turn of events.
Well, that was the end of March, and then we found that within a week or so, all of a sudden, Trump is back to criticizing Zelensky or the Ukrainian position, and actually even saying that Putin is the only one who wants peace.
Putin is bombing Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do you still believe him when he tells you that he wants peace?
I believe him. I believe him. I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine. I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine.
For the simple reason that he was pushing this idea of negotiations, and Zelensky was digging his heels in. He was digging his heels in, first of all, about the fact that as far as he's concerned, there needs to be a ceasefire first. But secondly, about the fact that the American notion of a peace plan involved America actually recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea, which would be a massive breach of international law, it's worth mentioning, but also implicitly accepting the rest of the occupied territory. So in other words, allowing the Russians to get away with having stolen 20% of Ukraine.
Again, a huge shift in very little time. If we think the first shift towards Zelensky was caused by this day on the golf course with Alexander Stubb, do we have any sense of where the counter-narrative is coming from? Who is convincing Trump that maybe he should take the Russian side on this?
There's three people that we need to be thinking in this context. First of all is J.D. Vance, the vice president, who is certainly no great fan of Zelensky's, but above all, he's actually in many ways, quite isolationist. So this is a man who generally would actually like to see the United States pivot away from its extensive support for Ukraine and its involvement in the conflict. We have Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's personal representative and negotiator, not just with Russia, but also actually in the Middle East, a very rich property lawyer, Trump's kind of guy, but who nonetheless clearly is very heavily invested in reaching some kind of a deal. And the third person is Trump himself. And I think having convinced himself that he, the master deal maker, would be able to bring peace to the conflict and perhaps from that get his Nobel Peace Prize. I think Trump himself was in a way keen to be seduced by the vision of a deal. But at this particular time, he had a peace deal that he thought worked, that of course was not really enough for Putin and far, far too much for Zelensky. But from his point of view, anyone who stood in the way of that was also actually jeopardizing his glorious deal.
He perhaps regretted his form of words. As you say, he managed to post that Putin was the only one who wanted peace. And very quickly, a whole series of Russian attacks on Ukraine made those words look a little hollow.
Ukraine says more than 70 missiles and 150 drones targeted several cities, but Kyiv was hit the hardest.
Large explosions were reported and at least 9 people have been killed. It is one of the biggest attacks in recent months.
Yes, the last thing that Trump ever likes is to be made to look like a fool. And in this case, from the Russians' point of view, it made sense to launch the attacks, especially on Kyiv, that they did, in that they were trying to basically keep up the pressure. They wanted to be signaling to the Ukrainians, you better agree to this deal, or else this is what's going to happen. But also probably perversely to the Americans. There is this strong sort of sentimental concern on Trump's part about the casualties of this awful war. And I think there was this sense of this gives you an incentive to essentially push the peace deal all the harder. It was a massive miscalculation because precisely from Trump's point of view, not only was he horrified, but also he disliked that sense that he was going out on a limb for Putin and Putin was making him look bad. And that's precisely why we then have Trump going on social media, which again seems to be his go-to instrument for international diplomacy these days, and saying that he shouldn't have done that.
Not long after posting this rare rebuke of Russia's president on his Truth Social platform, saying, quote, "I'm not happy with Russian strikes on Kyiv. Not necessary and very bad timing. Vladimir, stop."
And again, questioning Putin's motivation, questioning Putin's commitment to peace.
It does feel like at this point it goes from being a foreign policy spat to something he feels quite personally. This is now a slight. He said Putin was a man of peace. He's proved the opposite. Just tell us, in the meantime, on the Ukrainian front, we'd had a catastrophic meeting, as we all know, in the White House between Zelensky and Trump. They're scheduled around this moment to meet again at the Pope's funeral, and it does feel like the Ukrainians have suddenly really understood how to play Trump.
Yes, they've learnt fast. I mean, again, if we go back to that Oval Office meeting, now, in part, that was precisely because it was just simply sort of badly put together. In part, it was because of the unhelpful role played by J.D. Vance. But we also have to recognise that Zelensky had not really understood the new rules of the game. I think he just thought that he could rely on his usual approach, which was a combination of hearty chumminess along with moral outrage at the admittedly terrible things that the Russians are doing. That's not necessarily how you comport yourself in the court of King Donald. He failed to really be the supplicant. Zelensky had realised that he needed to operate differently. And the best way of doing that was precisely on not just neutral territory, but territory which left Donald Trump himself feeling it's in some kind of a moral deficit, shall we say. So I think this particular meeting was very different. I mean, there were these extraordinary pictures of them, so the two of them in the middle of this huge Vatican hall. It was not about playing to the cameras. It was not about playing to the other courtiers. It was just two men, Zelensky very much not just pushing an earnest moral message, but also flattering Trump as the only man who can really save Ukraine.
It is a remarkable meeting. Where has it left things now? I mean, what is Trump's attitude towards both Zelensky and Putin as we speak?
There's two things we need to talk about here. One of them is the resources deal, and the other one is the proposed negotiations. Now, the resources deal came from a rather sort of odd beginning. At first, back at the end of last year, the Ukrainians were encouraging the Americans to commit to developing Ukraine's natural resources as a way of helping it to rebuild after the war. At first, under Trump, what this turned into was an incredibly colonialist, quite frankly, proposal, which would see a sort of substantial share of all of Ukraine's natural resources, its coal, its other rare minerals, its gas, essentially being sort of put into control of a company which the Americans would actually have a dominant say in. This was something that Zelensky was absolutely unwilling to sign. And again, it was a bone of contention with the White House. So instead, the Ukrainians came back and they managed to finesse this into a deal which is still not great for Ukraine, but nonetheless is much, much more equitable. It sees guaranteed investments into the reconstruction of the country. And in the process, in effect, turned Ukraine in the eyes of an American president who, let's be honest, is essentially a businessman. He sees himself more than anything else as the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated. And so this deal turned Ukraine from being a deficit line item, in other words, something that you spend money on, into a potential profit line item. And so I think from his point of view, it really did change the way he thought about Ukraine. He has a reason to be engaged. So that's the first process. And the second one is we saw very recently on Saturday in Kiev, a collection of Western leaders, so-called Coalition of the Willing, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and their counterparts from Germany and Poland, coming and essentially trying to foist a ceasefire on Putin. And this is what really has started the sort of process to the current Istanbul talks. But it's that combination of, a short-term process of leaders apparently with Trump's backing, though he then flip-flopped, so trying to force a ceasefire against the backdrop of Trump's changing perception of Ukraine.
So, Mark, you're explaining how Trump's changing perception of the Ukraine-Russia conflict has kind of led to talks about talks this week in Istanbul. Just explain how it's played out in both Russia and Ukraine. I mean, how seriously are people taking the idea of these talks?
Frankly, it's a theatre with just one man in the audience, and that's Donald Trump. Because if you go back to it, I mean, there was a demand for an immediate unconditional ceasefire that Trump apparently seemed supportive. At that point, Putin seems to have realized that he could not afford to continue to look like the person who's standing in the way of peace. So he made a countermove. In a very late night press conference, the late night timing was probably intended to play to the American news cycle. Putin says no to a ceasefire, but yes to direct talks in Istanbul. And it's something that, it's clearly just sort of come out of nowhere. I mean, even Turkey's President Erdogan hasn't yet been asked if Istanbul was available as a venue. He has since said it is. And then move and counter-move is then met with yet another move from Zelensky, in which he says, look, I still want to have a ceasefire before we can have meaningful talks. However, I shall be there in Istanbul, personally.
I will be in Turkey this Thursday, May 15th, and I'm expecting Putin in Turkey. Personally, we are ready to talk to end the war.
So essentially, he's throwing down the gauntlet to Putin. So each of them is in some ways escalating along their own particular track. But there's no real peace proposals there. The Russians are planning to return to negotiations positions from 2022, which isn't going to get anywhere. The Ukrainians aren't really making any signs that they have any sort of particular proposals in store. It's kind of past the parcel. No one wants to be the one to outrage Donald Trump.
It's very hard to know if these talks will actually happen, and if they do, how serious they will be. But at some point, there will have to be talks. Do we have a sense of what's on the table?
Trump's original proposal, which quite frankly, if Vladimir Putin had actually asked me for my advice, I would have said he should have accepted.
Wait by your phone.
Well, yeah, but then I think, given that Putin barred me from Russia in 2022, I suspect I'm probably not high on his call list. It is clear that was a very generous set of offers. But the point is, it was a set of offers which came from the United States rather than from Ukraine. America was making deals that Ukraine could not possibly countenance. It's not as if Ukraine at that point was saying that it was willing to allow Russia to get away with its annexations and the like.
So this is the offer of Crimea being Russian.
Well, the interesting thing about the American deal is the previous American deal was that America itself would formally accept Crimea's annexation. In other words, it would consider Crimea to be legally Russian. As for the other occupied territories, it would not recognize them, but it would expect Ukraine to, in effect, commit to not trying to take them back by force. So it holds out the prospect that maybe someday there could be some kind of a peace agreement which sees it return. But nonetheless, in practice, it would mean that 20% of Ukraine that the Russians have seized would still be in Russian hands. Now, Ukraine itself cannot offer those same terms. The Ukrainian constitution would have to be rewritten to allow it to recognize Crimea as Russian. And to rewrite the constitution, it requires a national referendum. It's a whole process, a referendum which cannot take place during a time of war or martial law. Ukrainians themselves, when they're polled, there is a growing proportion who are willing to say some territory could be given up in the name of peace, but not all of that territory. So I think there is an extent to which the tragedy is that I see that the furthest that Putin can go in his own mind to still being a successful war leader, and the furthest that Zelensky can go and retain some kind of national consensus behind him are still very far apart. So, we will have to see a certain amount of going back to the drawing board. But this is the point about peace terms. They do take time.
Is the best both sides can hope for at this stage that they show willing, they look like they want to talk, but they hope that the talks basically collapse?
It's an incredibly cynical thing to say, and unfortunately I'm cynical enough to agree with you at the moment. This is not a natural and organic process. This is not the Russians and the Ukrainians agreeing amongst themselves that it is time to start to try to talk. This is purely driven by pressure from the United States. And in that respect, there's a key uncertainty. It's clear the Americans have said that they're no longer going to be running around trying to actually arrange the negotiations themselves. But we don't know what the next step is. Do they essentially maintain the Biden-era policy of supporting Ukraine? Do they step that up? Or conversely, do they step that down? And I think this is why, particularly at this present moment, both Putin and Zelensky are especially worried about what Trump might be thinking. And there is a possibility, after all, that Trump will end up supporting Ukraine more strongly than Biden did, if he truly feels that Putin is taking him for a ride. So everyone is being very cautious.
Some of his recent comments on social media, again, do sound like he's edging towards that position.
It is. But the thing is that there's a difference between being angry with Putin and being angry enough with Putin that you wish to put physical resources behind that. It would take quite a bit to actually push him into being more interventionist than Biden. But certainly the way I kind of almost envisage how to try and understand Trump is that he's a very, very wavy line on a graph. But nonetheless, there is a through line. One averages out that line. And if we follow that through line, it is definitely bending more towards Ukraine's position rather than Russia's now.
Mark, just stepping back, for anyone trying to make sense of this, as you say, there is a lot of flip-flopping. This is a very wavy line. Donald Trump has at times seemed to be at quite the opposite end. I mean, there have even been rumours circulating quite openly about people sort of suspecting him almost to be a Russian asset because he's been so pro-Russia. As somebody who knows Russia well, I mean, what have you made of all of that?
It's long been a tempting line of argument. Firstly, because in some ways it exonerates the American body politic from having anything to do with this. And secondly, because, well, it lends itself to the sort of the cinematic view of history. But let's be perfectly honest. At the end of Trump's first presidency, American policy towards Russia was tougher than it was at any stage since the end of the Cold War in 1991. So, whatever Trump may say, and let's be honest, it's not just Putin. Trump has never met an autocrat he doesn't seem to like. But, whatever he may say, as he desperately wants to sort of fit himself into the club of wannabe strongmen, the fact of the matter is that all the attempts to find some sort of direct line, some definite sense that he had been recruited, have really come to very, very little, if anything. Yes, we have Trump wanting to big himself up as a friend of Putin's at a time when clearly he had never actually met Putin. We have all these interesting little signs, but they don't really add up to saying that Trump is a Russian asset. And if they did, well, he's being handled very, very badly. Because as I say, at the moment, Trump is actually driving Russian policy rather than the other way round.
That was Professor Mark Galeotti, historian, author, director of Mayak Intelligence and regular contributor to the Sunday Times. Today's producer was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll help others to find us. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.